Hi, my name is Amir Adibi, and I'm with Adibi IP Group. We're intellectual property professionals helping innovators protect their intellectual property. Today, we're going to be talking about open source licenses, open source software, and intellectual property around the entire open source culture, movement, subculture. Open source licensing are types of licenses that allow and encourage software developers to put their software and source code out into the general public, but do it in a way that makes it so that it can stay in the public domain. Typically, the objective of the software developer is to have their software out in the public domain, to push the boundaries of computer science, push the frontiers of technology, with the idea that they will be credited so their name will get to remain on the source code, and also make it so that others can't then take their source code and turn it proprietary. So basically what it ensures is that the public will remain in possession of this intellectual property. So the public will be able to use and build and grow upon that underlying software. Open source licenses are really, really valuable because what they do is they allow developers to create innovative software knowing that future developers are going to be able to build upon it. So the open source community is huge. It's worldwide. It spans borders. It spans cultures. Open source licenses are, again, they're legal arrangements. And so fundamentally, to really get down to it, you have to actually read, review, and understand what the underlying license is. Because the underlying license is going to set forth what the restrictions are in the use of that open source software. Now, typically, when people use the word open source in general parlance, what they mean is that you can then take that source code and do whatever you want with it. That's often the case, but not necessarily always. And so if you really want to be sure, you need to actually review the underlying license and what the terms are of that source code. Now, one of the things that sometimes trips people up is when they use source code that's open source in a proprietary software product. The question being, does the proprietary software product then become automatically open source by dint of having open source software in that project? That's a really important thing to understand if you're trying to develop a proprietary software product that you want to use and sell. Because if it's open source, then you're going to have a very, very hard time selling that as proprietary software. One thing to remember is that oftentimes what some companies do is they actually do make money off of open source software. It's important to remember that sometimes services use open source software, but people still pay for the services. You might wonder, well, why? Why is that? Well, it's because, think about it, you would still have to take the source code, compile it, and then implement it on your own device. Whereas if there's a service that simplifies that, makes it easy for the consumer to just use their customer-facing product that's very easy to use, customers are still going to want to pay for that service possibly. Just because something is open source doesn't mean that you can't necessarily make money off of it. And so that's something to remember and to keep in mind. Open source software, again, it's really important to look at the underlying license and understand what the restrictions are. Because if you are trying to maintain proprietary code, you're going to want to make sure that somehow having certain source code that has certain restrictions on use isn't going to prevent you from keeping your source code proprietary. When you're trying to determine what open source license to use, you want to focus on what your objective is. What are you trying to accomplish? And what restrictions do you want down the line? So, do you want developers to be able to take your code and then use your code commercially? Do you want developers to be able to take your code and add to it and then make that bundled package proprietary? If that's going to be a problem to you, then you're going to want to take that into consideration when you're crafting your license or when you're using a common license that's already out there. Two very common and popular open source licenses that you might see are the MIT open license and also the GPL, the new public license. One common license, for example, is the GPL license. Now, the reason why GPL is important is because of the example that I gave before, where any software that incorporates their software, if that developer wants that software that incorporates their software to remain in the public domain, then they're going to want to use a copyleft license like the GPL public license. GPL is going to require that any derivative software products also be open to the public and have the same restrictions as the underlying source code that the developer put out there. Now, this is in contrast with the MIT open license, which actually allows developers to take existing open source software under the MIT license and then create derivative software that is then proprietary and not subject to the same restrictions as the underlying source code that was taken from. I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. If you are in the open source domain or are creating software products that use open source software, I highly encourage you to talk to an intellectual property professional because there are a lot of nuances in the law. Open source licensing is extremely important for the advancement of software and across all frontiers. And you want to focus on what the underlying license is and understand it if you're going to be using it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.